The morning mist clung to Millbrook's empty streets like a shroud, and Cordelia Nash knew something was terribly wrong. As the town's emergency dispatch coordinator, she had witnessed her share of crises, floods, fires, the occasional domestic dispute, but nothing had prepared her for the eerie silence that blanketed the usually bustling downtown area. Her coffee grew cold in her trembling hands as she peered through the station's reinforced windows, watching for any sign of life beyond the swirling fog. Across town, Dr. Thessaly Winters was experiencing her own mounting dread. The emergency room at Millbrook General had been unusually quiet for the past 6 hours, an unsettling calm that made her skin crawl. She had tried calling her colleagues, her friends, even her estranged sister in Portland, but every line went straight to voicemail. The last patient she had treated was a vagrant with strange bite marks on his forearm, marks that defied medical explanation and seemed to pulse with an otherworldly infection. In the suburban neighborhoods where white picket fences once promised safety and normalcy, Magnolia Hartwell was discovering that her carefully ordered world had crumbled overnight. The former Marine-turned-high school principal had always prided herself on maintaining control, but as she stepped outside to retrieve her morning newspaper, she found her neighbor Mrs. Patterson shuffling across her lawn with jerky, unnatural movements. The elderly woman's skin had taken on a sickly gray pallor, and when she turned toward Magnolia, her eyes were milky white and utterly vacant. The transformation had begun 3 days earlier, though none of the women could have known it at the time. A military transport carrying classified biological specimens had crashed in the wooded hills outside Millbrook, its contents seeping into the groundwater and spreading through the population with ruthless efficiency. The pathogen worked quietly at first, targeting the nervous system and rewriting basic human instincts. Men seemed particularly susceptible to its effects, succumbing within hours to a violent, mindless hunger that turned them into shambling predators. Women, however, possessed a curious resistance to the infection, not immunity, but a delayed reaction that bought them precious time. This biological quirk would prove to be humanity's last hope, though the survivors didn't yet understand the magnitude of their burden. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the concealing mist, the true horror of their situation began to reveal itself in all its devastating clarity. Cordelia's radio crackled to life with a desperate transmission from the neighboring county. "This is Sheriff Morrison in Westfield. If anyone can hear this, the dead are walking. They're attacking everyone they can find. We've lost contact with the state police, the National Guard. God help us, they're everywhere." The transmission dissolved into static, then screams, then nothing. Dr. Winters felt her medical training kick in as she witnessed her first zombie attack through the hospital's main entrance. A group of infected individuals, or what had once been individuals, pressed their decaying faces against the glass, their fingernails scraping and clawing with relentless determination. Their movements were disjointed and wrong, like marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer, but their intent was unmistakably predatory. She quickly activated the hospital's lockdown protocols, sealing the emergency exits and preparing for what she instinctively knew would be a prolonged siege. Magnolia's military experience served her well as she assessed the tactical situation developing in her neighborhood. From her second-story window, she could see that at least half the residents had been transformed into these shambling horrors, while the other half had simply vanished, either fled or consumed. She couldn't be sure which. Her training told her to establish a defensible position, gather intelligence, and wait for backup that she increasingly suspected would never come. The three women, separated by miles but united by circumstance, began to understand that they were facing something unprecedented in human history. This wasn't a natural disaster that could be weathered or a human conflict that could be negotiated. This was an existential threat that demanded everything they had ever learned about survival, leadership, and the fierce protective instincts that had been forged in the crucible of their diverse experiences. As the day progressed and the scope of the catastrophe became clear, each woman made the same grim calculation: if they were going to survive, they would need to find others like themselves. The infected showed no signs of intelligence or organization, driven only by an insatiable hunger for living flesh, but they compensated for their limitations with sheer numbers and an apparent immunity to pain or fatigue. The battle for Millbrook, and perhaps for the future of humanity itself, was about to begin, fought not by soldiers or heroes, but by ordinary women who would discover extraordinary strength in the face of the unthinkable. The sound of splintering would echo through Magnolia's house as the front door finally gave way under the persistent assault of 3 infected neighbors. She had barricaded herself in the upstairs bathroom, her service pistol loaded and ready, but she knew that hiding would only delay the inevitable. Drawing on her Marine Corps training, she steadied her breathing and prepared to fight her way out of what had become a death trap. The first zombie stumbled up the stairs with the lurching gait she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of the infected. It had once been Mr. Henderson from 2 houses down, a retired accountant who used to wave at her every morning while walking his golden retriever. Now his business suit hung in tatters, dark stains spreading across the fabric, and his jaw hung at an unnatural angle. Magnolia didn't hesitate, she put 2 rounds center mass, dropping him instantly. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Dr. Winters was discovering that medical ethics became complicated when your patients were trying to eat you. The emergency room had become a fortress of overturned gurneys and barricaded doors, but her small group of survivors, 2 nurses, a janitor, and a terrified orderly, were running low on both ammunition and hope. The infected seemed drawn to the hospital like moths to flame, perhaps attracted by the concentration of potential prey or simply following some base instinct toward places where the living might seek shelter. Thessaly had always prided herself on saving lives, but now she found herself calculating the most efficient ways to end them. The medical literature had no protocols for dealing with reanimated corpses, but her observations suggested that only catastrophic brain trauma could stop them permanently. It was a harsh lesson that went against everything she had sworn to uphold as a physician. Cordelia's position at the emergency services building gave her a unique advantage: access to communications equipment and detailed knowledge of the town's infrastructure. She had managed to establish contact with scattered groups of survivors throughout Millbrook, coordinating their movements and sharing vital intelligence about zombie concentrations. Her dispatcher's training in crisis management was proving invaluable, though nothing had prepared her for coordinating resistance against the walking dead. Through her radio network, she had learned that the infection followed a predictable pattern: rapid onset in male victims, delayed symptoms in females, and complete breakdown of social order within 72 hours. The mathematics were grimly simple: for every woman who survived the initial wave, there were at least a dozen infected individuals hunting her. The odds were getting worse by the hour as more survivors succumbed to the disease or were simply overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The 3 women's paths began to converge as Cordelia directed Magnolia toward the hospital, reasoning that Dr. Winters' medical expertise and defensive position made it the logical rallying point for organized resistance. Magnolia's military background would provide the tactical leadership they desperately needed, while Cordelia's communications hub could coordinate their expanded operations. The journey across town proved to be a nightmare gauntlet of abandoned vehicles, prowling infected, and the constant threat of being surrounded. Magnolia moved from shadow to shadow, using her knowledge of urban warfare to avoid large groups while eliminating stragglers with ruthless efficiency. She had learned to conserve ammunition, relying instead on improvised weapons: a crowbar taken from an abandoned hardware store, a machete from a sporting goods shop, anything that could deliver the killing blow without making noise. Each encounter taught her something new about her enemies. They were drawn to sound and movement but seemed to have limited visual acuity. They felt no pain and showed no fear, but they were also predictable in their behavior, following the most direct path toward their prey without tactical thinking. Most importantly, they retained just enough motor function to be dangerous while lacking any of the higher cognitive abilities that might make them truly formidable opponents. Dr. Winters watched from the hospital's upper floors as a lone figure approached through the parking lot, moving with purpose and discipline that marked her immediately as a survivor rather than one of the infected. The woman, tall, athletic, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dispatched 3 zombies with clinical efficiency before signaling toward the hospital's main entrance. The reunion was brief but emotionally charged. Here were 3 women from completely different backgrounds, thrown together by circumstances that would have been unimaginable just days earlier, yet finding in each other the partnership that might mean the difference between extinction and survival. They shared their stories, their observations, and their growing understanding that they were fighting not just for their own lives but for something much larger. Cordelia's radio crackled with reports from her scattered network. Small groups of survivors holed up in schools, churches, and private homes, all following the same desperate playbook of barricades and ammunition rationing. But she was also receiving disturbing intelligence about organized zombie behavior in some areas, large groups moving with apparent coordination, as if guided by some primitive collective intelligence. As night fell over Millbrook, the three women began planning their next moves. They had shelter, weapons, and communication, but they also had a growing understanding of the scope of their challenge. The infection was spreading beyond their small town, and if the radio reports were accurate, similar outbreaks were occurring across the region. They weren't just fighting for Millbrook, they might be fighting for the future of human civilization itself. Dawn brought no relief, only a clearer view of the devastation that had consumed their world overnight. From the hospital's roof, the three women could see smoke rising from dozens of locations across Millbrook, marking the spots where desperate survivors had made their final stands. The streets below teemed with shuffling figures, their numbers seemingly doubled since the previous day as more residents succumbed to the infection or emerged from hiding places that had been compromised. Cordelia's radio had become their lifeline to hope, crackling with transmissions from survivor groups across the county. Through careful coordination, she had identified 17 separate clusters of resistance, each following similar patterns of defense and resource management. More significantly, she had confirmed what they all suspected: women were surviving at dramatically higher rates than men, creating an unexpected demographic shift that would define the nature of their resistance movement. Among the voices reaching them through the static was Venetia Cross, a former Army logistics specialist who had fortified the town's elementary school with a group of teachers and staff. Her military experience complemented Magnolia's combat training, and together they began developing tactical doctrines specifically adapted to fighting the undead. The school's layout provided excellent sight lines and multiple escape routes, while its kitchen facilities could support a larger group of survivors. Dr. Winters had been monitoring the infection's progression through careful observation of captured specimens, zombies they had managed to restrain for study purposes. Her findings were both disturbing and oddly encouraging. The pathogen seemed to burn through its hosts rapidly, causing significant deterioration in motor function and cognitive ability within days of infection. This suggested that the zombie threat might eventually consume itself, but only if the survivors could outlast the initial waves of infection. The discovery of Imogen Blackwood's group changed everything. A former federal emergency management coordinator, Imogen had been visiting family in Millbrook when the outbreak began and found herself trapped with valuable knowledge about government contingency plans. Through Cordelia's network, she revealed that Millbrook was just one of dozens of affected areas, and that federal authorities had written off the entire region as a containment zone. No rescue was coming, they were truly on their own. But Imogen brought more than just devastating news. Her understanding of emergency protocols and resource distribution networks provided the framework for something unprecedented, a coordinated resistance movement that could span multiple communities and perhaps even counties. She had identified supply caches, communication relays, and defensive positions that could be linked together into a comprehensive survival network. The women's individual strengths began to synergize in unexpected ways. Magnolia's tactical expertise guided their combat operations, while Dr. Winter's medical knowledge kept them healthy and provided crucial intelligence about their enemies. Cordelia's communication skills bound their scattered allies together, and Imogen's strategic thinking gave them objectives beyond mere survival. Venetia's logistics background ensured they could sustain their operations over the long term. Their first major operation was a coordinated strike against the zombie concentration surrounding the town's police station. The building contained weapons, ammunition, and protective equipment that could dramatically improve their survival odds, but it was also heavily infested with infected officers and civilians who had sought shelter there during the initial outbreak. The attack required precise timing and absolute discipline, exactly the kind of challenge that would test their emerging leadership structure. The assault began at dawn, with multiple teams moving simultaneously against predetermined targets. Magnolia led the main force while Venetia coordinated diversionary attacks designed to draw zombies away from the primary objective. Dr. Winters established a field medical station in a nearby building, ready to treat casualties, while Cordelia maintained communication links between all elements of the operation. The fighting was brutal and intimate in ways that conventional warfare could never prepare them for. These weren't enemy soldiers following orders or driven by ideology, they were neighbors, friends, and family members transformed into mindless predators. Each zombie they destroyed had once been someone's loved one, and the psychological toll of such combat was unlike anything the military veterans among them had experienced. But they succeeded, securing not only weapons and equipment but also rescuing 6 survivors who had been trapped in the station's holding cells. Among them was Serafina Moss, a young social worker whose knowledge of the town's population and social networks would prove invaluable in locating other survivor groups. Her addition to their leadership council brought fresh perspectives on community organization and psychological resilience. As they consolidated their gains and planned their next moves, the women began to understand that they were creating something entirely new, not just a survival group or even a resistance movement, but the foundations of a post-apocalyptic society. The old world's hierarchies and assumptions had died with the infected, leaving them free to build something better from the ruins. The radio networks buzzed with reports of similar successes in other communities, each following the template they had developed in Millbrook. Women's groups were proving remarkably effective at zombie warfare, combining tactical flexibility with emotional intelligence and collaborative leadership styles that seemed perfectly adapted to their new reality. For the first time since the outbreak began, they dared to believe that humanity might not only survive but emerge stronger from its darkest hour. 3 weeks after the initial outbreak, the women's network had evolved into something resembling a military organization, though one unlike any that had existed before. Their command structure was fluid and collaborative, with decisions emerging from discussion rather than being imposed from above. This approach might have been inefficient in conventional warfare, but it proved remarkably effective against an enemy that required constant adaptation and creative problem-solving. Magnolia had established training protocols that transformed ordinary women into effective zombie fighters. The curriculum covered everything from close-quarters combat techniques to psychological conditioning, recognizing that mental preparation was just as important as physical skills. Her trainees learned to overcome their natural reluctance to destroy human-like targets, while also maintaining the emotional connections that kept them fundamentally human. The most promising recruits were organized into mobile strike teams, each capable of independent operations while remaining linked to the larger network through Cordelia's communication system. These teams specialized in different aspects of survival warfare: reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, supply acquisition, rescue operations, and tactical strikes against zombie concentrations that threatened survivor enclaves. Dr. Winters had made a breakthrough that changed their understanding of the infection entirely. Through careful study of blood samples from immune women, she discovered that estrogen levels seemed to correlate with resistance to the pathogen. This explained why postmenopausal women like herself showed delayed infection rates, while younger women demonstrated near-complete immunity during certain phases of their reproductive cycles. The implications were staggering. They weren't just surviving by chance, but by biological design. Her research suggested that the pathogen might have been engineered specifically to target male physiology, though whether this was intentional or simply an evolutionary accident remained unclear. What mattered was that women possessed a natural advantage that could be enhanced through understanding and preparation. She began developing protocols for monitoring hormone levels and identifying women who might be most vulnerable to infection. Imogen's strategic planning had identified their next major objective, the regional airport 40 miles north of Millbrook. Intelligence suggested that several military aircraft had been abandoned there during the initial chaos, potentially containing communication equipment that could expand their network's reach dramatically. More importantly, the airport's fuel reserves could power extended operations and support the kind of mobility that would be essential for long-term survival. The expedition to secure the airport would be their most ambitious operation yet, requiring coordination between multiple survivor groups and precise timing to avoid the massive zombie herds that had begun forming in the open countryside. These herds represented a new phase in the infection's evolution, thousands of zombies moving together with apparent purpose, stripping entire regions of any remaining life. Venetia's logistics analysis revealed both the challenge and the opportunity presented by these herds. While they posed an existential threat to any fixed position, they also represented a concentrated target that could be eliminated through carefully planned operations. Her proposal was audacious. Rather than simply avoiding the herds, they should actively hunt them, using coordinated strikes to reduce the overall zombie population while claiming the resources left behind in their wake. The debate over this strategy revealed fundamental differences in how the women viewed their situation. Some, led by Dr. Winters, advocated for a defensive approach focused on establishing sustainable enclaves that could outlast the infection's natural burnout period. Others, including Magnolia and Venetia, pushed for aggressive expansion that would actively reclaim territory and resources from the undead. Serafina emerged as a voice for a third way, offensive operations designed not just to clear territory, but to rescue survivors and expand their network's human resources. Her social work background had taught her to think in terms of community development and long-term resilience, perspectives that proved invaluable in planning for a post-zombie future. The synthesis of these approaches became their defining doctrine: aggressive expansion combined with careful consolidation, always with an eye toward building something sustainable rather than merely surviving. They would clear territory, rescue survivors, and establish new nodes in their network, creating a web of interconnected communities that could support each other through mutual aid and shared resources. Their first test of this integrated strategy came when Cordelia's radio network detected a large group of survivors trapped in a shopping mall 20 miles east. The facility was surrounded by hundreds of zombies attracted by the noise and activity of the people inside, creating a siege situation that would require all their specialized capabilities to resolve successfully. The rescue operation became a masterclass in their evolved tactical doctrine. Venetia's logistics teams prepositioned supplies and escape routes, while Magnolia's combat units prepared diversionary attacks to draw zombies away from the main assault. Dr. Winters established forward medical stations, and Imogen coordinated overall strategy from the command post Cordelia had established in a commandeered radio tower. The assault itself was a symphony of controlled violence and precise coordination. Strike teams hit predetermined targets simultaneously, creating corridors of escape for the trapped survivors while systematically eliminating zombie concentrations. The operation rescued 43 people, mostly women and children, while also claiming significant supplies and equipment from the mall's stores. But the real victory was psychological. Word of the successful rescue spread through their radio network, reaching survivor groups across the region and beyond. The women of Millbrook had proven that organized resistance was not only possible but effective, providing hope to countless others who had been barely hanging on in isolated pockets of survival. As they integrated the rescued survivors into their growing community, the women began to envision something unprecedented: a society built entirely by women, for the protection and advancement of all survivors regardless of gender. It would be a world where traditional hierarchies had been replaced by collaborative leadership, where strength was measured not in dominance but in the ability to protect and nurture those who needed shelter from the storm. The success at the shopping mall had come at a cost that became apparent only in the days that followed. Among the rescued survivors was Ophelia Sterling, a young mother whose infant daughter had been infected during the final stages of the siege. The child showed none of the violent symptoms typical of the adult infected, instead entering a kind of suspended animation that challenged everything Dr. Winters thought she understood about the pathogen. The discovery forced them to confront an ethical dilemma that had no precedent in human experience. The infected child posed no immediate threat, but she also showed no sign of recovery or normal development. Dr. Winters' medical analysis suggested that the pathogen had essentially frozen the child's neural development while keeping her basic biological functions operational. She was neither alive in any meaningful sense nor truly dead, a living embodiment of the gray area between humanity and monstrosity that defined their new world. Ophelia's anguish became a catalyst for broader discussions about the kind of society they were building. Some argued that resources should be focused on the clearly viable survivors, while others insisted that their humanity depended on protecting even the most vulnerable members of their community. The debate revealed deep philosophical divisions that had been masked by the immediate necessity of survival operations. Magnolia found herself caught between her military training, which emphasized hard tactical decisions, and her growing understanding that their movement's moral authority depended on maintaining principles that separated them from mere survival groups. The infected child represented a test of those principles that would define their community's character for generations to come. Meanwhile, Cordelia's communication network had detected disturbing changes in zombie behavior patterns across the region. The mindless shambling hordes they had learned to combat were being replaced by more organized groups that showed signs of primitive tactical thinking. Some zombies were using tools, others were coordinating simple ambush tactics, and a few seemed capable of basic problem-solving that suggested the pathogen was continuing to evolve. These enhanced zombies posed threats that their current tactics were ill-equipped to handle. Traditional zombie fighting doctrine relied on the infected being predictable and stupid, but these new variants showed signs of learning from previous encounters and adapting their behavior accordingly. The implications were terrifying. If the pathogen could enhance zombie intelligence while maintaining their aggressive drive, the women's technological and organizational advantages might evaporate. Dr. Winters threw herself into studying the new zombie variants, using specimens captured during recent encounters to understand how the pathogen was mutating. Her findings suggested that the infection was entering a new phase, one that traded raw numbers for enhanced capability. The mindless hordes were dying off as their bodies burned out, but the survivors were becoming something more dangerous, a new species entirely. Imogen's strategic analysis painted an even bleaker picture. Intelligence from their expanding network suggested that similar evolutionary pressures were occurring across the continent, with zombie populations consolidating into smaller but more effective groups. The brief window of opportunity during which human survivors could organize resistance was closing rapidly, replaced by an arms race between human intelligence and zombie adaptation. The pressure to accelerate their expansion became overwhelming. Every day they delayed meant losing potential allies to zombie evolution or resource depletion. Yet rapid expansion also meant accepting greater risks and potentially compromising the careful community building that had made their success possible in the first place. Venetia proposed an audacious solution. Rather than waiting for zombie evolution to make their current tactics obsolete, they should actively accelerate the process while they still maintained advantages in mobility and organization. Her plan involved deliberate strikes against zombie populations designed to force rapid evolutionary pressure while harvesting the resources needed to support their own technological advancement. The proposal horrified some members of their leadership council, who saw it as a dangerous form of biological warfare that could spiral beyond their control. Others argued that they were already engaged in biological warfare and that passive approaches would only guarantee their eventual defeat. The debate consumed days of precious time while zombie populations continued their ominous evolution. Serafina's perspective ultimately proved decisive. Her social work background had taught her that sustainable change required addressing root causes rather than symptoms, and she argued that their real enemy wasn't the zombies themselves but the social collapse that had made the outbreak possible. Their mission should be rebuilding civilization in a form resistant to future catastrophes, not merely winning a war against the current threat. This broader vision provided the framework for resolving their tactical disagreements. They would continue aggressive expansion, but always with an eye toward creating institutions and relationships that could survive beyond the current crisis. Every operation would be evaluated not just for its immediate tactical value but for its contribution to long-term community resilience. The infected child became a symbol of this approach. Rather than making a utilitarian calculation about resource allocation, they established protocols for caring for all survivors regardless of their condition or prospects for recovery. The decision sent a powerful message to other survivor groups about the kind of society they were building. One that measured success by its ability to protect the vulnerable rather than simply eliminate threats. As they prepared for their next major operation, the assault on the regional airport, the women carried with them a deeper understanding of what they were fighting for. It wasn't just survival or even victory over the zombie threat, but the preservation and evolution of human values in an inhuman world. Every decision they made, every life they saved or lost, was writing the first chapter of a new civilization that would either transcend the failures of the old world or repeat them in even more devastating forms. The weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable, but it also provided a clarity of purpose that made even the most difficult decisions possible. They were no longer just survivors fighting for their lives, they were the founders of humanity's future, and that future would be judged by how well they balanced pragmatism with principle in the crucible of the zombie apocalypse. The assault on the regional airport began before dawn on a gray October morning, 47 days after the initial outbreak. 300 women from 17 survivor communities had converged on predetermined positions around the facility's perimeter, representing the largest coordinated military operation since the collapse of conventional government. The stakes could not have been higher. Success would provide them with communication capabilities that could unite survivor groups across the continent, while failure would likely result in the destruction of their entire movement. Magnolia's tactical planning had evolved into something approaching art, each element of the operation choreographed to exploit zombie behavioral patterns while minimizing exposure to the enhanced variants that increasingly dominated infected populations. Her scouts had identified 6 distinct zombie types within the airport's boundaries, from the familiar shambling hordes to the terrifying stalkers, enhanced zombies that showed pack hunting behaviors and rudimentary tool use. The airport's layout presented both opportunities and challenges. Its open spaces provided excellent fields of fire for their marksmen, but also offered little cover for advancing infantry. The terminal buildings could serve as defensive positions, but they might also become death traps if the assault teams became surrounded. Most critically, the fuel storage areas represented both their primary objective and their greatest vulnerability. One stray spark could turn their victory into a catastrophic defeat. Dr. Winters had established a field hospital in an abandoned office complex 2 miles from the airport, equipped with supplies and personnel to handle mass casualties. Her research into zombie physiology had revealed new weaknesses that could be exploited tactically, but also new threats that made even minor zombie wounds potentially fatal. The enhanced variants seemed capable of injecting additional pathogens through their bites, creating infections that could kill even immune women within hours. Cordelia's communication network had become the nervous system of their operation, linking every unit to Central Command while maintaining contact with survivor groups across the region. Her operators monitored emergency frequencies for signs of military or government activity, though none had been detected for weeks. The silence was both liberating and terrifying. They were truly alone, free to build their new world but without any safety net if their experiment in survival failed. The first phase of the assault focused on eliminating zombie scouts and establishing forward observation posts. Venetia's logistics teams had pre-positioned supplies and ammunition at carefully selected locations, creating a web of support that would sustain the assault teams through an extended operation. Her analysis suggested they had perhaps 6 hours before zombie reinforcements from surrounding areas would arrive in numbers that could overwhelm their forces. Imogen coordinated the overall strategy from a mobile command post that could relocate quickly if the tactical situation changed. Her experience with federal emergency operations had taught her to expect the unexpected, and she had prepared contingency plans for everything from equipment failures to zombie mutations they hadn't yet encountered. The complexity of managing such a large operation across multiple tactical domains tested every aspect of their emerging command structure. The actual assault began with diversionary attacks on the airport's northern perimeter, designed to draw zombie forces away from the main terminal where their primary objectives were located. Strike teams armed with suppressed weapons eliminated zombie sentries with clinical precision, while explosive charges destroyed key infrastructure that could channel zombie movements toward their advancing forces. Serafina led one of the rescue teams tasked with locating any survivors who might be trapped within the airport complex. Her social work training had taught her to read human behavior and identify signs of concealed survivors, skills that proved invaluable in the post-apocalyptic environment. Her team's discovery of 12 survivors in the airport's air traffic control tower represented an unexpected bonus that more than justified the operation's risks. The enhanced zombies proved to be everything their intelligence had suggested and worse. These variants moved with purpose and coordination that made them qualitatively different from the mindless hordes they had learned to defeat. Some used airport equipment as weapons, others coordinated flanking maneuvers that suggested genuine tactical thinking, and a few demonstrated problem-solving abilities that approached human levels of intelligence. The fighting in the terminal's main concourse became a nightmare of close-quarters combat against enemies that combined human intelligence with inhuman resilience. Magnolia's combat teams found themselves adapting tactics in real time as they encountered zombie behaviors that defied their training and experience. Traditional suppression techniques failed against enemies that felt no fear, while conventional infantry doctrine proved inadequate against opponents that could absorb tremendous damage while continuing to fight. Dr. Winter's field hospital began receiving casualties that challenged her understanding of both human physiology and combat medicine. The enhanced zombies' bites created infections that progressed with terrifying speed, requiring immediate amputation to prevent system-wide contamination. Her surgical teams worked under conditions that would have been unthinkable in the old world, performing life-saving operations while artillery fire shook the building and zombie attacks tested their perimeter defenses. The breakthrough came when Venetia's logistics analysis identified a critical vulnerability in zombie group behavior. The enhanced variants seemed to follow rudimentary command structures, with certain individuals serving as coordinators for larger groups. Eliminating these leader variants caused temporary confusion among their followers, creating windows of opportunity that could be exploited by well-positioned assault teams. This discovery transformed their tactical approach from pure attrition to targeted elimination of zombie command structures. Special hunting teams equipped with precision weapons began stalking leader variants while conventional forces exploited the resulting chaos to advance toward their objectives. The strategy was dangerous and required split-second timing, but it offered hope for victory against enemies that had seemed invincible just hours earlier. As the sun reached its zenith, the women's forces had secured most of their primary objectives within the airport complex. The communication equipment they sought was intact and operational, while fuel reserves exceeded their most optimistic projections. More importantly, they had proven that their collaborative command structure could function effectively under the extreme stress of large-scale combat operations. But victory came with a sobering recognition of how much their world had changed. The enhanced zombies represented a new phase in the infection's evolution, one that would require entirely new approaches to survival and resistance. The brief period when human survivors could rely on zombie stupidity and predictability was ending, replaced by an arms race between human adaptability and zombie enhancement that would define their struggle for years to come. The successful capture of the airport transformed their isolated resistance movement into something unprecedented in human history, a continental network of survivor communities linked by secure communications and bound together by shared principles of collaborative leadership and mutual aid. Within days of establishing their primary communication hub, Cordelia's operators were in contact with women's groups as far away as Alaska and Florida, each reporting similar patterns of female resistance and zombie evolution. The intelligence picture that emerged from these contacts was both encouraging and terrifying. Across North America, women had indeed demonstrated remarkable resistance to the infection, creating pockets of organized civilization amid the zombie-infested ruins of the old world. However, they also confirmed that zombie evolution was accelerating everywhere, with enhanced variants appearing in increasing numbers and displaying ever more sophisticated behaviors. Dr. Winters found herself at the center of a continent-wide research collaboration, sharing data with surviving scientists and medical professionals who had reached similar conclusions about the infection's biological mechanisms. The collective research effort revealed that the pathogen was not merely evolving randomly, but following predictable patterns that suggested either intelligent design or an underlying biological program that guided its development. The most disturbing discovery was that the enhanced zombies were not the infection's final form. Evidence from laboratories in Chicago and Atlanta suggested that the pathogen was capable of producing variants that retained most human cognitive abilities while maintaining the aggressive drive and physical resilience of the infected. These hybrid zombies could potentially infiltrate survivor communities undetected, gathering intelligence and sabotaging defenses from within. Magnolia's tactical doctrine evolved rapidly to address these new threats, incorporating counterintelligence protocols and enhanced security screening that would have been unthinkable in their earlier operations. Every new recruit underwent extensive observation periods, while existing community members were subject to regular health screenings designed to detect early signs of infection. The measures were necessary but created an atmosphere of suspicion that threatened the collaborative spirit that had made their movement successful. Imogen's strategic planning now operated on a continental scale, coordinating resource flows and population movements across thousands of miles of zombie-infested territory. Her analysis suggested that their window for establishing a sustainable post-apocalyptic civilization was closing rapidly, as zombie evolution continued to erode their technological and organizational advantages. The network would need to achieve critical mass within months, or risk being overwhelmed by enhanced variants that could match human intelligence while retaining zombie resilience. Venetia's logistics operations had become a masterpiece of improvisation and efficiency, managing supply chains that stretched across multiple time zones while operating under constant threat from zombie attack. Her teams had established secure transportation corridors linking key survivor communities, creating a skeleton infrastructure that could support the kind of large-scale operations necessary for continental reconquest. The moral complexity of their situation deepened as reports arrived of conflicts between survivor groups, some of which had degenerated into something approaching feudalism or military dictatorship. The Women's Network found itself in the position of choosing sides in disputes that often involved fundamental questions about human rights and social organization. Their decisions would shape not only their own communities but the entire trajectory of post-apocalyptic civilization. Serafina's community development programs had expanded into a comprehensive system for integrating refugees and establishing new settlements in cleared territory. Her approach emphasized psychological healing and social reconstruction, recognizing that military victories would be meaningless without the human infrastructure necessary to sustain peaceful communities. The challenge was maintaining these values while operating under the constant pressure of zombie threats and resource scarcity. The network's first major crisis came when a large survivor community in Texas requested military assistance against a coordinated zombie assault led by hybrid variants. The attack represented a new level of zombie tactical sophistication, with infected forces demonstrating abilities that included equipment use, basic engineering, and what appeared to be strategic planning. If the hybrids could coordinate such operations, they posed an existential threat to every survivor community on the continent. The debate over whether to commit forces to Texas revealed deep divisions within the network's leadership. Some argued that they needed to concentrate their resources on defending established communities rather than overextending themselves in foreign interventions. Others insisted that allowing any community to fall to hybrid zombie attacks would encourage similar assaults elsewhere, potentially triggering a cascade of defeats that could destroy their entire movement. Magnolia emerged as the strongest advocate for intervention, arguing that their military doctrine required maintaining the initiative against zombie forces rather than allowing them to choose the time and place of engagement. Her analysis suggested that the hybrid zombies were testing their responses, gathering intelligence about network capabilities while probing for weaknesses that could be exploited in future operations. The decision to deploy a rapid response force to Texas became the network's defining moment, demonstrating their commitment to mutual defense while testing their ability to project power across continental distances. The operation required unprecedented coordination between multiple communities, with forces drawn from as far away as the Pacific Northwest converging on a battlefield in the heart of zombie-controlled territory. Dr. Winters accompanied the medical support teams, bringing with her experimental treatments designed to counter hybrid zombie infections. Her research had identified potential pharmaceutical interventions that could slow or reverse the infection process, though testing them under combat conditions represented an enormous risk to both patients and medical personnel. The stakes were too high to rely on untested theories, but they were also too high to ignore any potential advantage. Cordelia's communications specialists established a field command center that could coordinate the multi-state operation while maintaining secure links to the continental network. The complexity of managing real-time intelligence across such distances pushed their equipment and personnel to their absolute limits, but also demonstrated capabilities that would prove essential for future large-scale operations. The battle for the Texas community became a proving ground for tactics specifically designed to counter hybrid zombie intelligence. Rather than relying on the predictable behavior patterns that had served them against conventional zombies, Magnolia's forces employed deception, misdirection, and psychological warfare designed to exploit the hybrids' retained human emotions and cognitive biases. The fighting revealed that hybrid zombies retained more human characteristics than anyone had anticipated. They showed fear when confronted with overwhelming force, could be demoralized by tactical defeats, and seemed capable of genuine strategic thinking that made them formidable opponents. However, they also retained human weaknesses. They could be fooled by camouflage and misdirection, became confused when their plans were disrupted, and showed signs of internal conflict between their human memories and zombie instincts. Victory in Texas came at a terrible cost. Nearly a third of the intervention force was lost, including several irreplaceable specialists whose skills would be desperately needed for future operations. The rescued community was so damaged that most survivors chose to relocate to more secure areas rather than attempt to rebuild in place. Yet the strategic implications of the victory were profound. They had proven that hybrid zombies could be defeated through coordinated human action. More importantly, the operation revealed that the network had evolved into something approaching a functional government, capable of making collective decisions and implementing them across vast distances despite the absence of traditional state structures. The women's collaborative leadership model had proven itself under the ultimate test, maintaining both effectiveness and moral authority even under extreme pressure. As intelligence reports flowed in from across the continent, a clearer picture emerged of the zombie infection's trajectory. The pathogen appeared to be approaching a stable state, with hybrid variants representing its optimal balance between intelligence and aggression. This suggested that further evolution was unlikely, creating a strategic environment that could be understood and countered through appropriate doctrine and tactics. The recognition that they were fighting not for temporary survival but for permanent control of their continent marked a fundamental shift in the network's self-perception. They were no longer refugees from civilization's collapse but the architects of its reconstruction, responsible for creating institutions and values that would guide humanity's future development. The weight of that responsibility was almost crushing, but it also provided a sense of purpose that transcended individual survival. 2 years after the first zombie appeared in Millbrook's morning mist, Cordelia Nash stood on the observation deck of what had once been the Federal Emergency Management Agency's regional headquarters, now serving as the Continental Command Center for the Women's Liberation Network. The irony of the name was not lost on her. They had indeed liberated women, though from threats that the original feminists could never have imagined. Through the reinforced windows, she could see construction crews working on new settlements that stretched to the horizon, islands of human civilization slowly expanding to reclaim their world from the infected dead. The statistics painted a picture of gradual but unmistakable victory. Zombie populations had stabilized at roughly 10% of their peak numbers, with hybrid variants maintaining small but persistent communities in remote areas that posed manageable security challenges rather than existential threats. The network now encompassed over 300 settlements across North America, with similar organizations emerging on other continents as communication links were gradually restored. Dr. Thessaly Winters had become something approaching a folk hero, her medical research having developed treatments that could prevent zombie infection in 97% of cases while offering hope for recovery even among hybrid variants. Her field hospitals had evolved into medical schools that trained a new generation of healers, women who understood disease not just as biological phenomena but as symptoms of social breakdown that required comprehensive treatment. The infected child who had sparked so much debate, Ophelia Sterling's daughter, had become a symbol of the network's values in ways none of them could have anticipated. Now 3 years old chronologically but developmentally frozen at her infection point, little Luna served as a reminder of the costs of their survival and the importance of protecting the vulnerable. The specialized care facilities developed for her and others like her had become models for comprehensive social support that extended far beyond medical treatment. Magnolia Hartwell had transformed her military expertise into something unprecedented, a defense doctrine based on protection rather than domination, designed to preserve communities rather than destroy enemies. Her academies trained not just soldiers but community defenders who understood that true security came from social resilience rather than superior firepower. The warrior protector ethos she developed had spread throughout the network, creating a military culture unlike anything in human history. Imogen Blackwood's strategic vision had evolved into the constitutional framework for their emerging confederation of communities. Her understanding of emergency management had proven perfectly suited to designing institutions that could function effectively under constant pressure while maintaining democratic accountability. The governance structures she helped create balanced local autonomy with collective action, allowing communities to develop according to their own values while participating in continent-wide coordination. Venetia Cross had become the architect of their new economy, developing trade networks and resource allocation systems that ensured sustainable development while maintaining the collaborative values that defined their movement. Her logistics expertise had created supply chains resilient enough to function despite zombie threats while flexible enough to support rapid expansion into newly cleared territories. Serafina Moss had perhaps achieved the most profound transformation of all, her social work background evolving into a comprehensive approach to community healing that addressed not just the trauma of zombie apocalypse but the underlying social pathologies that had made such catastrophes possible. Her programs for conflict resolution, community integration, and psychological support had become the foundation for a new understanding of human development that emphasized cooperation over competition. The women often gathered in the evening to reflect on how far they had traveled from those desperate early days when survival seemed impossible and hope felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. Their casual conversations revealed the depth of their achievement. They had not simply survived the zombie apocalypse but had used it as an opportunity to create something better than what had come before. The challenges they faced were no longer primarily military but developmental. How could they maintain their collaborative values while managing communities of hundreds of thousands? How could they balance the need for security with the desire for individual freedom? How could they ensure that their children understood the values that had made their survival possible without burdening them with the trauma that had forged those values? Reports from around the world suggested that their experiment was being replicated elsewhere, with women's networks emerging as the dominant form of post-apocalyptic organization on every continent. The zombie pathogen had indeed changed humanity, but not in the way its creators had intended. Instead of destroying civilization, it had forced the emergence of new forms of social organization that might prove more resilient and humane than anything that had existed before. As the sun set over their transformed landscape, Cordelia activated the global communication network that now linked survivor communities across 6 continents. The evening reports told stories of continued progress. New settlements established, zombie populations reduced, trade relationships expanded, and most importantly, children born who would grow up knowing only the collaborative world their mothers had built from the ashes of the old. The zombie apocalypse had ended not with a final battle but with the slow, patient work of reconstruction. The women who had stood against the undead army had become the founders of humanity's next chapter, their legacy measured not in enemies defeated but in communities created, not in territory conquered but in values preserved and evolved. Standing there in the command center that had become the beating heart of their new world, surrounded by the quiet hum of communications equipment linking their global network, Cordelia felt a profound sense of completion. They had answered the question that the zombie apocalypse had posed: what would humans become when their old world died? The answer was something stronger, more compassionate, and more resilient than anything that had come before. The Walking Dead had taught them that survival was not enough, they had to create something worth surviving for. In doing so, they had discovered that the greatest enemy of humanity had never been the zombies, but humanity's own failure to recognize its potential for cooperation, growth, and love. The apocalypse had ended, but the real work of building the future was just beginning, carried forward by women who had learned that true strength came not from what they could destroy, but from what they could protect, nurture, and create together. In the distance, children played in gardens that grew where zombie hordes had once roamed, their laughter carrying on the evening wind like a promise that the darkness was finally, definitively, past.